Welcome. My name is Gena Timberman, and you are listening to Timber People, a podcast about people who, like timber, are strong, build and create, who gather us together like fuel that feeds fire. People who support structures of our community that uplift and protect. Welcome to the show. What a pleasure it is today, a gift to welcome my longtime friend, Trace Savage, to the show. Welcome.
Hey, Gena, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. I can't wait to take the selfie at the end with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know that you have been the warrior in the trenches on the journalism front. And I want to go back to, we've known each other for many, many years, and you have always had your a thoughtful just presence on the pulse of what's happening at the state capitol and how constituents throughout our state are affected. And I know this has been an incredibly busy, crazy time of year. And I just want to thank you for coming onto the show today.
Well, thank you. We're almost to the end of the 2024 regular legislative session. I think we met around the time that we founded NonDoc in September 2015.
Right.
I can't believe it's been 9 years. It's almost 9 years. It's wild. It took a little bit of time to realize maybe a niche we could pursue was legislative coverage. We're trying to do things a little differently. Leveraging some of the opportunities that the internet provides in terms of primary source documents and linking to bills and trying to get a little deeper than maybe some traditional coverage gets. But as you alluded, and as we were discussing before the show started, it is that time of year. There's trauma triggers all around in terms of politicians. I just said jokingly, how mad could they possibly get at me? And so we'll find out. We are in the final 7-8 days of the regular session. Knock on wood, without disrupting the recording here. We're not going into special immediately after this, but it's been an interesting year. And if you wherever you want to start and talk, I could certainly talk about this year's new public budget process, but there's a lot of other things we care about as well mutually that I'm glad to chat about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Foundationally, I really appreciate the vision that you had behind NonDoc. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what's on the horizon here in a bit, but really what started this vision and that mission, because I know that for one, you're knowledgeable about the process. You're an educated journalist, from OU and Norman native as well. Mm-hmm. And you know your way around the Capitol. You've developed the relationships that give you that frontline access. And you have the journalistic integrity for people to really talk with you about what is happening. And so you're behind the scenes. You really see how that legislative budgetary sausage, so to speak, is being made. Yeah. But, a lot of people will say, and I've said it before, that, people will think they're not in politics where, well, we all are, and it's from the roads we drive on to really any aspect of our daily lives. Legislation, no doubt, impacts us. And so I was really encouraged to know your vision behind NonDoc to share that across the board, reliable journalism that every citizen in our state needs.
Yeah, and that maybe is a good place to start, right? Like, what is NonDoc? It doesn't mean no doctors. We're not anti-doctor. We are. It was stolen from a quote from Walter Cronkite that we found in 2015 when we were looking to create a publication, and he said the word non-doctrine or non-doctrinaire, which sort of means being open-minded and having limiting your preconceived notions and examining each case on its merits. And we found that word in a quote in an edition of Playboy, an interview he did in Playboy in, I think, 1972. And we looked, and nondoctrine.com was available online. We bought that, and then we bought the shortened version from somebody of nondoc.com. And it's interesting because we didn't want like OK or OKC in the name. And we didn't want to pigeonhole ourselves like a lot of publications might do. And, this is all we focused on. And that was really helpful because early on, we actually published things from all around the world, right? When we didn't have any money to pay anybody anything, we'd have short stories or, essays or commentaries from different people on a variety of subjects. But when we came up with that name, it sort of emphasized goals that I already had as editor-in-chief, which was to adhere to what I would consider traditional journalism ethics and, being fair, prioritizing accuracy. If you make a mistake, issue a correction. If you're, talking to people about scenarios, talk to all folks involved. Don't just try to get clicks by leaving out a big part of the story or not doing that extra work necessary to try to be fair. Now, in fairness, our product has morphed over time. We used to do a lot more commentary. We were a little, maybe a little more news analysis, did a lot of journalism criticism at the beginning because one of the reasons I was getting back into journalism and one of the reasons I was sort of working to start something new was frustration with what the news landscape was, sort of how were not people either leading by example or talking about things that were problematic. And I don't want to waste our time going through examples that I remember all these years later, but sort of focusing back on the state capitol, when we started, former state senator Andrew Rice was the founder, and he, after about 6 months, sold the company to me and a guy named Josh McBee, and we were the two editors. And I think we bought it for $10 because we weren't making any money. And when about 2017 really was when I decided to go back to the Capitol more. Right out of college, journalism school, I had covered a couple sessions of the legislature and thought I wanted to do politics. Didn't want to do politics. Worked in healthcare for about 6 years. Similar to not wanting to do politics, I also didn't want to die in a cubicle. So I left the place I was working in healthcare to, pursue this opportunity. And when we started, because we had a Democratic former politician as our founder, we thought that people were going to, not want to talk to us on the political right, which in Oklahoma, in a Republican-dominated state, that could be, concerning, right? How do you gain the trust of people who'd go, well, wait a minute. Now, Andrew, obviously a very pragmatic individual and, good person. But what we found actually was it took longer to develop that trust from people on the political left, because initially there was this very broad presumption that we were on their quote unquote team. And whereas if we were trying to do things fairly and follow those non-doctrinaire principles, actually people more on the political right, at least in office, were sort of refreshed by that. And we could sort of, gain that trust over time. And yet we sort of started out with a different hill that we didn't even see, which was how do we convince people on the left, like, no, the goal of journalism is not to be on your side, just because maybe, we share some political beliefs and I have long hair doesn't mean that, I've always been a registered independent. Right. And the goal of journalism is to, focus on the facts, expose truth. There's a lot of goals, but anyway, it over time, one thing we've known is that building trust takes time. And it takes a long time, but you can lose it like that. And so, I was able to probably leverage some white male privilege into some of those rooms that with Republican lawmakers where maybe not everybody could kind of do that. And at the same time, you have to remember what your role is and that you're not there to be buddy with people. But at the same time, I'm not there to just try to, knock somebody's head off all the time either. And I think that is, if we want to talk about journalism in a modern context, I do worry that sometimes, investigative journalism or our industry views our success or our impact on, did someone resign from office or did someone get prosecuted or did someone, what was, and I don't know that is always the best way to do it. Now, we went nonprofit in late 2019. So let me be clear that we get a lot of grant funding, have to do a lot of grant reports, and there's always questions on what's your impact, like any other nonprofit, right? But it's a little more difficult as a journal. What do you say? If you're running a healthcare organization or an education organization or some other nonprofit where you point to, yes, we fed X thousands of people, or we clothed X thousands of people, or that's tangible measurement. What is impact in journalism, right? Is it how many clicks you got on a website? Is it that you exposed some scandal? Is it that you prevented perhaps unwise appropriation of funds because of revealing information? And this maybe takes us to where we are today, May 24th, I'm sorry. Time is a flat circle. We just got done with 8 public budget hearings for the public for the first time,
which has been crazy. It's been a crazy year.
It was almost so public. It was almost so transparent that most people couldn't follow it. Right. I mean, I'm up there. I live, breathe this stuff, and I'm sitting there for hours on hours, trying to keep my eye on the ball, and it's really, really hard. I mean, there were things that were agreed to, and I do not remember the statements being made because, you're flying through hundreds of line items and things. And after the fact, I'm like, was that really approved? What day was that? Oh, that was during hour 7, of day 3. And I'm sitting there going, when? Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, to get back to that, we thought that we need to kind of track that as an impact, because I was trying to live tweet, all of the budget summits. And I can't tell you how many people who were, kind of cut from your cloth, of somebody who cares and pays attention and knows the process, had the same reaction of, wow, this is kind of cool, but I cannot watch this all day long.
I don't know how you did it. I mean, that's a tall order, and that's a lot of work.
It was also trying to thread the needle of how do you make this interesting, and how do you have a few jokes, but not too many jokes to offend people. And, I made a joke at the end of the last budget summit. At the very end, it was the final tweet I'd made, and I said, and now they're going to the House to honor basketball teams and some crap. And like 2 minutes later, I said that to somebody, and they were like, no, it's Speaker McCall's going away speech today. And I was like, oh my God. And so I had to delete so I was just trying to joke about how they constantly, honor basketball teams in the spring. And I was like, oh, good Lord, I don't want people to take that joke the wrong way. So, it was an interesting experience. And I'm curious your thoughts as somebody who, I'm sure your listeners already are aware of your background in terms of, focusing on state government. But what was your thought as somebody who, at least at one point, was a full 2-foot inside Capitol insider?
I have to say, I really appreciate the work that you do in providing that level of transparency. And transparency has its benefits and burdens. And the benefit is opening up that dialogue of what these different line item funding opportunities mean for communities and for business or law enforcement or education. And that can mean a lot, but also for someone who really hasn't followed the process before, it can become, really daunting to really sift through and get an interpretation of what that really means as it trickles out and throughout our communities and to constituents around the state. And so I really appreciate that you can distill these complex experiences in developing budgets and following legislations into a manageable way for anyone to really take it in, because we all know that in recent times, and these haven't been the only times of what you could say, quote unquote, fake news and of clickbait on what we see through social media, and that being able to concisely give the summary that people can take away and from a nonpartisan standpoint, really understand what it means for anyone, no matter which side of the aisle that you're on politically, that you can really take that and chew on and understand, how is this going to impact me and my family? So we were talking before the show started that working with the state for many years, state agency director, and, was engaged with the state almost 15 years, is that process is challenging, and the relationships and the awareness and education and your advocacy that you provide for the work that you do from any agency or initiative capacity is it's really challenging. It's a lot of work. And I was saying to you earlier that, I run more anxious this time of year. I think it's from that history and that cyclical, but it's so important. And it's something that, a lot of people think they're not in politics, they are, and everyone should have a say and really kind of put our hands in it and really take a piece of it and really understand what it means, because it's impactful and it does affect our daily lives. So I appreciate you asking me that.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting. I think your average observer might think, well, there's Republicans in every state office. There's Republican supermajorities in the Senate and the House. What could they argue about, right? And I think that I hear this from people, lobbyists who have maybe clients come in from out of state for something and they're watching and they're sort of blown away, that there are so many different alliances and allegiances and fractions. The big one obviously is urban versus rural. That's
Right.
been that when Democrats had vast supermajorities in the House and Senate for frankly the majority of the state's history, right?
Mhm.
You had those same disputes, and now a lot of the moderate Republicans in the Capitol 20 years ago, they would have been the moderate Democrats, right?
Right.
And so it's a lot of similar dynamics still playing out today. And I mentioned that we had a hill to climb, really with both sides of the political aisle to gain credibility, as we talked about. But one of the things that I like to say about that is that if I can't talk to Republicans and have enough of their respect that they'll tell me things, then how could I possibly know and report on what's going on? If I were covering the New York General Assembly and I didn't have relationships with Democrats to tell me what was going on, I wouldn't know anything either, right? Like you as a journalist, I don't get to choose who's in charge, right? I get one vote like any other citizen does on a ballot. And so you have to be able to sort of be annoyed by dumb stuff you see without sort of shooting your mouth off too much on social media or somewhere. Right. And not that I haven't done that. I mean, but that's part of the goal, right? And if we talk about our values and things like that we value at NonDoc, our mission is to produce and distribute quality journalism with context that enables civic engagement. And our vision is to sustain reporting on undercovered civic topics that enables, again, that engagement and that discussion. And then our values are things like accuracy, fairness, transparency, community, diversity, and the historical record. Mm-hmm. And even just doing those Twitter threads, right, is furthering that historical record, because myself, even going back, and what happened on Thursday? What happened on Tuesday? Oh, this is what they discussed it. This is how they described it. So I don't know. I mean, if I'm talking in circles and not making a lot of sense, it's probably just because I've been wandering around the Capitol too long. Well, but it's that time of year. Insightful. It's that time of year, and we're getting ready up for elections. And then, something I would love to chat about a little bit is, we've made an intentional decision that we certainly hope is viewed positively, to the extent that governments ever want anybody to pay attention to them, what they do. But in a post McGirt v. Oklahoma world, right, we've really thought, boy, we need to really provide some basic coverage of sovereign tribal nations. Absolutely. And of course, with 38 federally recognized tribes, there's a ton of elections. It's very, that's where we've started, right? Is that as we, try to focus on things, the minimum we can do is provide some basic overview of what are the decisions being made in sovereign nations in terms of elected officials, who are the players involved, what are the dynamics, and that, is a change from something, 9 years ago when we started the publication. I don't think I ever would have really thought about that. On the other hand, I can't tell you how constantly learning things about, whether it's federal Indian law precedent, whether it's just the different ways that different nations' governmental systems and electoral systems are set up. And I think it's, again, how do you do it without, judgment, but with illumination? And then there's moments where, a leader of a government isn't thrilled about something we wrote. And you're like, oh man, I don't know, as a white guy, like this is a tough situation to be in. And then you hear from citizens who are not in elected office, voters, and they're thrilled that we're paying attention, right? And that we're trying to provide that information. So I just kind of threw that in there because it's an interesting landscape that we're in Oklahoma. I like to say that I think we have more government per capita than anywhere else in the country.
Oh, absolutely. And really understanding what sovereignty means and what it means to be in Oklahoma, being a witness and participant in so many respects to that reality, that uprooting and dislocation, the presence and contribution of tribes in Oklahoma today, past, present, what it means for our future, that awareness and understanding for anyone, native or non-native, is really integral to understanding American democracy, what America has meant, and who we are and where we're going tomorrow.
Yeah. And I had a journalism professor a long time ago who said, don't ever use the word unique, and so just generally try to avoid that. But I also had the privilege of, my father taught Oklahoma history for 35 years at OU. And so I learned a lot about the American history that, bad and good, right? But also, how we got to where we are. And I think that sometimes I forget now that I'm, pushing 40, right? Like there's so many people who didn't have that examination. I mean, not to get all over the map here, but how many people never learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre in school, right? And now, we've got a lot more awareness of that. But there's people who are my age and older who go, I never heard about it. My dad had students every year who were from Tulsa public schools who'd never heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre, in the 80s and the 90s. And so, those are the political dynamics. I guess I just brought this up because it's something that, yes, our bread and butter is legislative coverage and state electoral cycles and all that. But I also really, am fascinated and interested in and care about the challenges and the questions that face sovereign tribal nations, because whether you, I don't even know where to start, right? Because there's just so many different dynamics. But you've got, situations where the first thing off the top of my head is, the city of Lawton is dumping, waste in a creek that is, affecting the land of the Comanche Nation. You've got concerns about the rare metal mining, down there. You've got all sorts of questions. You have electoral questions, so there's so many things. And yet I also think that Oklahoma broadly, we often don't like to talk about our big challenges.
Right. And it's one thing you're talking about the Tulsa, race riot massacre, and as well as, removal and the realities, from traumatic historic events as they relate to our Oklahoma history. It's one thing to know what you don't know, but it's another thing to know that there are these realities and to have that information out there and to refuse to learn. And that is the point that is very challenging to accept. And it's important that we continue to warrior on in furtherance of the awareness and the really advocating for people to learn about these truths, these facts.
Right. Absolutely. And like, I just learned something the other day from a good friend of mine, Graham Brewer, who works for the AP, and, learned something I didn't know about Indian law and sort of history. Right. And like, those are, you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, wait a minute. Do I need to go back in an article from 2 years ago and kind of make a correction or something like that? Because as a journalist, it's actually, and this is sort of like a freeing thing, right? I mentioned this early in terms of how do you build trust, right? Is you've got to own mistakes and you've got to correct the public record and correct that chronicling of history, right? And in a lot of other professions, we don't do that, right? Like we don't talk about, you don't go revisit, a mistake that was made. And the reality is that in journalism, that's actually how you build credibility. But when I first started NonDoc, there was not a habit of that in Oklahoma. We've fallen away, especially on an online platform. If something ended up being wrong or there was a problem, the response was, we'll just delete the article off the internet. Well, the problem with that was people shared it on Twitter, people shared it on Facebook, people shared it on, right. And so it's like, and then you click it and it's like, it's 404 error, not there. And that's not the way to go about that, right? The way to go about that is to own your mistake and to update the information and provide. And if somebody goes after the fact, the reason you do that is, let's say you read something 3 days ago, and you have a discussion with somebody, and they go, "I don't think that's true," and you go, "Well, I think it is. Let me go back to NonDoc," and you look, and you're like, "Well, that's not there where I remember it. Oh, there's a correction. This was changed." Right. Okay. That's why I'm not crazy. I did read this, but then it turns out that they didn't have that right. So they corrected it. Right. Well, what if you had never read the original version in the first place? So you're reading the article, you read through, you get to the bottom and it says correction. This was updated. The value of that is, oh, they care. Right. I know I didn't see the error, but I know that they went to the trouble to go make that correction and note that they did it. Right. And so those from a journalism standpoint, those are things that if you're really going to dive into the most complicated issues, and court matters and things that you're intimately familiar with as an attorney, as a tribal citizen, knowing that most people, even in political arenas, don't know the procedural history, the political history, the cultural history, and trying to illuminate those things, and then also acknowledge, like, when you don't, what did you say? What know what you don't know.
Yes, I mean, I get it if you don't know what you don't know, but once there's that awareness there, then you can't really turn your back on learning about, these realities.
Right. And I think that, and again, I'm jumping all over the place here, but when you have so much government, when you have 77 counties with 8 elected officials in each county, and all these different judges and retention ballots, and then school district elections, and we've got 521 school districts, which is just a wild number of school districts. And then you've got things called circuit engineering districts, and then, which nobody knows what those do unless you're like on a county commissioner board and you want to try to make your own asphalt emulsion, and then you get charged for crimes. But anyway, the little Joe Don Dickey shout out down there in Tillman County, but they got a problem with the sheriff's race down there. I just learned this morning. But you've got all that. You've got 149 elected legislators. You've got statewide races that are labor commissioner and insurance commissioner, and there was a guy who keeps running for lieutenant governor on the platform of abolish the lieutenant governor because it doesn't do anything, So you've got all that level of government. And then in addition, you have 38 federally recognized tribes that have their own executive branch, legislative branch, usually often judicial branch, or perhaps BIA court, right? So and then we've got 3 federal court districts in Oklahoma, and the Eastern District used to be like sort of a snoozer, and is where you could run, and now it's like incredibly busy in a post-McGirt world. So, like, how do you, as a citizen, keep track of all those things, care about all those things, right? How am I supposed to care who the county treasurer is? Like, right? Like, how am I supposed to decide that? And so, until I guess he, or a clerk who, is impervious to alcohol or whatever it was we had with a certain individual here in Oklahoma County. But like, those things are, we think about this in terms of impact of journalism. I'm never going to get 3 million Oklahomans to read every little thing we do about, different governments and these things. And that's okay, right? The expectation can't be, well, we're failing because there were only 5,000 people who read this story about what the budget looked like, right? Because the reality is everywhere you go, most people are worried about their own budget. They're worried about their own kids.
Right.
They're worried about these matters. So sometimes it's daunting because you're sitting there going, hey, on the one hand, 5,000 people reading this story is good. On the other hand, it's not that many people. Yeah.
Well, it's so important that we have news sources within our states, these points of journalism that can objectively, with integrity, present the facts and awareness of what's happening around us. My big frustration oftentimes comes with this interpretation that what's happening on the federal level is the reality of what's happening in our state, whether you're Democrat, Republican. And many of our citizens may not realize that, the Oklahoma Democrat historically has been different than what one might think of as a Democrat from another state or from the national news or perspective. And, we have to learn about the politics and the realities and our own history to really understand where we are in this great grand spider web paradigm here.
Yeah. And and that's a challenge that we face too, right? Like how do I'm not competing with Fox News.
Right.
And yet people who might listen to Fox News or MSNBC all day long, they think they're informed about what's going on in their local government.
Right.
And
it could
they're
be
not.
It could be a regurgitation of just something they heard rather than thoughtfully reading through, no matter which news source it is,
Right.
but thoughtfully reading through and understanding how it's applies to the life around us here in Oklahoma.
Yeah. And that is a big challenge because people vote. There was a state rep named Logan Phillips, who I think would serve 2 terms. And he ran the first time. I wrote a story about this, so I don't mind telling it. He's no longer in office, and good fella,
Right.
I can say that now. But he ran in, I think it was 2018, and he ran against at the time the Democratic minority leader Steve Copeland in Eastern Oklahoma, and Mr. Phillips filed. Copeland had one more term before he was term limited. And he said, he thought I'd just put my name on the ballot and then I'll run the next year when Copeland's no longer running. It's an open seat. I'll just get a little name ID. Didn't knock any doors. Didn't really we went to like one little function or something. Didn't, run. And he won. He ousted the Democratic minority leader, probably largely because of straight party voting and different turnout models. And in 2018, he said that the first hint that he had that something might be different was he was voting. And he said that 2 brothers came in and they asked the election poll worker, we're here to vote for Trump. How do we, cast that ballot for, and he went on the ballot. Yeah, right. They were there. They were fired up because there were some TV ads that were being run on like a vote for so-and-so is a vote for Trump and, this, that, or the other. And, Logan was sitting there going, what? And I think the guys said like, we've never voted before.
Yeah. See,
and they were ready.
That's what's hard is like, no matter what, no matter what side, but everyone should be voting.
Well, and right. And so, but to your point, people think, and there's structural reasons for this too. Right. I mean, if TV news is the most accessible way for people to put something on in the background, from a local TV news standpoint, there's a dozen counties that don't get Oklahoma Capitol government coverage. They get it out of Texas, in Ottawa County.
That's an important point.
The 9 tribes, they're getting their news from Joplin, right? Which has no Missouri government or even the Pittsburgh, Kansas. That doesn't affect the state that is, that they're technically in, right? And so that's the Panhandle, they get Amarillo news. Of course. And so you're it's on the one hand, it's like, yeah, okay, the public, the populace is not doing what they should. In other ways, it's really hard.
Yeah.
And so, that's when I said our mission statement earlier, I know we got to wrap up, but when I said our mission is to produce and distribute quality journals with context, I really think the next crisis, and I, on the one hand, I guess I'm glad no one else is really focused on it as much as we are, but because that's a competitive advantage. On the other hand, like as a citizen, like we need to recognize this. Distribution is a crisis in journalism because we're using Facebook, we're using Twitter, we're using Google, and these sort of third-party systems are able to throttle down news in exchange for clickbait that says, Gena, I literally saw this morning. It said, former Kansas City Chiefs running back cut, gobbled up by Steelers. And it's got a picture of a guy and I'm like, well, which running back is that? I better click to see. Right. It was like veteran Kansas City Chiefs running back. You know who it was? LaMichael Pirine. Like I care, right? Like, but I clicked it because it was in my feed because it knows I, follow football, and that's what.
Yeah, clickbait's real,
right? It is real, and it's we already mentioned former President Trump once, but like he played that term fake news to a lot of success. And I don't think we ever had a great conversation as a society, or let me put it this way, as an industry, a news industry, that we allowed that, right? We created the environment by which he could take that and delegitimize anything that was critical because our industry had been not adhering to the standards that we should have. There was a lot of fake news. There were a lot of things that were just slanted in a way or manipulative in a way. And I don't want to say both sides, all sides.
It just existed.
People with
yeah.
either narratives or interests, right? And it has existed for a long time. And he took it. He seized upon it. I think actually Hillary Clinton used that term like 3 or 4 years before Trump did in a speech herself. And it was actually like a term that she was referring to about the same phenomenon. He seized on it and, used it as a very manipulative tactic to sort of delegitimize anything that was maybe negative about his administration. But that was still, I think we should have had as a media industry some reckoning about that.
Oh, absolutely. And this goes back to, speaking of the Clinton era, but this goes back to a lot of the propaganda, the say or do anything to win era, which we're still surfing those waves, unfortunately. But no, I really appreciate the conversation that we have around this because it does impact all of us. And it's important. And
and it's real, I'm sure I feel like I'm going to think about this thing like, what did I say that's going to make somebody mad at me or whatever? But that is, again, if we go back to tribal governments, right? Like many tribes do not have a history of there being an independent press.
Oh, right.
At least recent history, right? Mm-hmm. There's not that history of that independent observer going, well, here's what happened at the, council
that goes
meeting.
Far back, even pre-removal too, because that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have, there were people sanctioning this in legislatures.
Sure. Yeah, there were treaties signed by, people who,
this isn't anything new.
Right. And so it is a sort of a thing of, I think that, and again, I don't mean that just about tribal governments. There are plenty of local, county, city, school board jurisdictions all over the country where there is nobody covering those things. And so there are two things at the national level that are really developing to change that. One, there's a thing called the Documenters Project, where essentially you train people who do not have a journalism background, but they care about their local suburban community. And there's no longer a journalist available to cover the city council there or to cover the school board or whatever. And so they'll take they get $50 a meeting, and they go to the meeting, and then they work with an editor to turn that into a basic summary of what happened. And it documents, here's what happened over time. And then you have that historical record that maybe a journalist comes along a year later, 2 years later, and now they have all the notes. Now they have all the information chronicled, and we can go back and see when did they vote on this? What was the vote? Who voted? All those things, right? So the Documenters Project, you can check it out, Google it, is really cool. I think it started, I want to say it started in Illinois. Don't hold me to it. There's some talk about that coming here in Oklahoma. It's not my news to share, so I don't want to. And then the other thing is, and this is a really fascinating question, is AI. Is to what extent do we use AI to help cover these meetings that we can't go to? We try to cover the city of Oklahoma City. We cover Edmond because the newspaper shut down there. We filled that void with a human journalist who, full-time, read it if you're in Edmond, donate if you're in Edmond, keep this. Because we thought if the fifth largest city in the state doesn't have a journalist, that's a civic crisis in the making. How can we expect anybody to care about anything else if they can't care about their water bill and, whatever it is, a $60 million art park or whatever. But anyway, but I say all that is that AI presents an opportunity. Because we cover those. Well, what about Bethany? What about Jones? What about Del City, Midwest City, War Acres?
Right.
There's dozens of municipalities that Hera, they've got an issue there with apparently, not having open meetings regularly posted, maybe and allegedly in the wrong. So how do we're not going to be able to hire 20 more journalists in the next month. So. But at the same time, AI is scary. It feels gross.
Oh, it's exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Right. We don't want to use it. I actually sent some of my staff members to like a national training, and they all had the same like stink face, like, man, I don't want to do it. And came back and one said, I'm really mad at how they won me over about this possibly being something we should use, and because it is scary. It's weird. We don't want the robots creating the news. And then also it sort of is insulting, right? Like I went to college, this is my skill, this is my livelihood. And now there's, a robot that can do this in 2 minutes.
It's a Black Mirror episode. It's like,
right. But if we think about what our due north as journalists should be, caring about the public, the reader. My interest is in what's in the best interest of the reader. That's the decision. If I face a decision that I have to make, how do we present this? What do we do? How do we handle this situation? That's the first question you ask, is what's in the best interest of the public?
Maximizing opportunities for distribution and information sharing, of course.
And so it's not like I can solve it with manpower. So maybe I solve it with, how do I provide more information? Maybe we use that technology. So maybe that's a conversation for another podcast, but maybe that's a good way to close things out. But
of course. No. So your website is nondoc.com.
NONDOC, NOND as in dog, OC as in cat. When I first started, I had a bad habit of saying D as in cat and C as in dog, which is just not a good. Well, I don't know why I was doing that, but yeah, that's how people can find us. I would encourage folks to sign up for our text message program. That's really, again, one of those ways we're trying to innovate a little bit. With you can pick your categories. My favorite are like legislative. If you're into education, that's a big one we follow. Then we've got Edmond, OKC, Norman. If you're into that, we've got healthcare, we've got energy. Our tribal affairs list is actually our fastest growing list.
Thank you so much for that.
And I think it's because there's just maybe not all that many folks out there paying attention to those sorts of things. And so that's one that has really grown over the last 6 months. We've got a great new hire in Tulsa, a guy named Tristan Lovelace, who's an attorney by trade, citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and is focused a lot on all these really fascinating. We've got like a roundup coming up on lawsuits involving the Muskogee Nation, right? Which is just like you're tracking these like 4 major litigations that are going to go on for 3 years, or whatever. So we're just trying to kind of cover that sort of stuff and say, what are these dynamics here? And people can make their own opinions about it, but we should at least follow the court system and follow really fascinating precedential matters that are occurring here in Oklahoma that affect, populations all over the country.
Well, thank you, Trey Savage. Thank you for the important work that you do. You're a warrior in good trenches. And I just can't say thank you enough for being on the show and for sharing what you're learning and your observations. And the experience and growth of NonDoc. It's important to all of us as Oklahomans. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and I look forward to coming back and
Of course, we'd love that.
Continuing to watch you as a warrior in the trenches doing great things.
Thank you so much. Yakoki. Yakoki. Thank you for joining us. Timber People is brought to you by the Possibilities Podcast platform.